Welcome back to the podcast. I am pleased to welcome Rik Offenberger back. Today, we're talking about something kind of different and outside the normal workings of the podcast. I usually cover comic books that are easily, readily available, usually in a digital format. But this time around, we're going to switch it up and we're talking about the Overstreet comic book price guide to Lost Universes. Because as Rik knows, I'm a big fan of history comic books. Before we talk about all that stuff, Rik, introduce yourself, tell the fans a little bit about yourself and why fans should be studying comic book history.
Well, I'm a comic book writer, publisher. I was a retailer. I was the public relations coordinator for Archie. I run First Comics News and G-Man Comics, and I've written for Newsarama, Comic Book Resources, the Comic Book Buyer's Guide when that existed. And I love comics. And I guess my introduction to the Lost Universe were the DC superheroes 100-page super spectaculars back in the 70s when I was a very little kid. They would reprint the Golden Age stories from Quality after DC bought Quality. And they'd reprint DC's Golden Age stories. But the Quality were the Lost Universe, the first one that's coming up, where they had canceled the books. They were out of business. They were dead as a doornail, and no one could get those. And unless you had the Golden Age stories, most of those were pulped, for the war drive. Somehow this helped the war effort to destroy children's comics. But DC was reprinting Dollman. DC was reprinting Phantom Lady. DC was reprinting the Blackhawks. DC was making news stories with the Blackhawks. Uncle Sam was showing up. There were a lot of interesting quality characters that DC bought and brought back. Then, after Fawcett had gone out of business and stopped publishing Captain Marvel, DC licensed Captain Marvel as Shazam
Do
in
they actually own
1972.
do they own Captain Marvel now?
Now,
Or
they
they own them?
licensed him in 72 and eventually they bought him. And in the interim, two other people published a Captain Marvel comic, with different Captain Marvels. And Marvel Comics, who owns the trademark for the name Captain Marvel on the cover of the comic, has published like 5 different Captain Marvels.
There is
But
a
yeah, DC had to call him Shazam in 1972 on the cover because they couldn't use the name Captain Marvel on the cover, so it was Shazam, and inside it was the original Captain Marvel. Um,
there is a ton of lost universes. One of the ones that I remember distinctly that has such potential was the Malibu Ultraverse universe in the early 90s that Marvel, who's now owned by Disney, eventually bought out. Why hasn't Disney Marvel done anything with the Malibu property since all that time?
I think that the problem they had with the Ultraverse is that it was co-owned by the creators. The creators had an equity share, and Marvel had done an equity share when they were having trouble hiring creators in the 90s. Once the direct market came out, there were a lot of creators that went to like First Comics, to Pacific Comics, big name creators that the smaller publishers were getting because they gave 100% equity into the characters for the creators. So if you did a John Sable freelance, you own John Sable at First Comic, and then they would make the movie and you'd get an equity in that. So Malibu, to attract top level creators, gave them an equity stake too. They didn't own 100%, they owned a partial equity. I don't know the percentage. And so when Marvel acquired Malibu, they got those characters, but they're still an equity stake in the original creators. And I think that after all the creators that they popularized and heroes they popularized, those people went off to form Image Comics and made a fortune off of their equity stake. Marvel was less inclined. And in addition, I think at Disney, they're even less inclined to spend money on other people's property when they have so much of their own property to mine. Who would guess Guardians of the Galaxy would ever be a mega hit, much less Rocket Raccoon? If you'd look through all of the Marvel catalog of everything they published, I don't think there was anyone pointing to Rocket Raccoon as the next star or Groot as being the next star when they're looking at the old Marvel comics that were in mothballs. I mean, even though Lost Universe is about comics that published and stopped and then started again. I did a piece on Captain Canuck, who has a variety of stops and starts. He's currently being published by Lev Gleason Publishing.
See, I
And
remember Captain Canuck back in the late 70s when I started going to comic book shops. They had the original Captain Canuck, and that was one of my first independent comics. Right up there with you. Remember Noble Comics and Justice Machine?
yes,
We were talking off camera about Nexus also had to start at Capital Comics, which was
yes.
another defunct company at the time. So, what made you guys decide to come up with this Lost Universe concept, and who are some of the other authors involved in it?
Well, Jeff Vaughn, who is at Gemstone Publishing, is the president there, he contacted me and he said he was doing a series called Lost Universes. And so they're all about, they're not necessarily defunct, you know what I mean? They just stopped and started and stopped and started. They were lost for a period of time because even continuity, which I did a piece on, that did stop completely. I mean, Neil Adams has passed. They still have a new book in previews coming out.
Yes.
So
What is that one all about? And
it's going to be
tell a little history about continuity comics for people who don't exactly know that and the connection to Neil Adams.
okay. Neil Adams worked in advertising while he worked in comics, and he had a studio called Continuity Studios, and he would in the interim between doing advertising products would do comics that he and the creators who worked there and mostly his family enjoyed working on. And his son-in-law wrote several of them. And they published them in fits and starts. They never really got into full-scale publishing. And they worked for other publishers. So he created a lot of creators through the studio who would end up working for other publishers on their titles too. Trevor Von Eden came from the studio. Dick Giordano was was over at DC running DC, and he was Neil Adams' main anchor for a period of time. A lot of people came out of that studio, and in the early 80s, they had full newsstand distribution when other people didn't. And they were in comic shops, and he produced a variety of comics were all superhero comics.
Is there a backstory involved in why continuity comics was so hit and miss and start and finished and
Well,
so many
I did an
lags?
interview with Neil, and I talked to him about that, and he said that initially they just did those in their downtime when they didn't have a project for DC or Marvel. They have sometimes their comics will have odd bylines. While Krusty Bunkers is one where like everyone in the studio draws something.
Yes.
And he owns a comic store called Krusty Bunkers too. A Hands or M Hands. M Hands stood for many hands. A Hands was all hands. And that's when you had everyone on deck penciling and inking, trying to hit that deadline if there was some problem where they gave it to them late because something, someone else fell through. And so when the studio didn't have advertising work and when the studio didn't have work from DC and Marvel, they produced the continuity comics. And the reason they came out was they just did them in their free time initially. It wasn't a thing where they were going to do.
It's more of a hobby than a business, I would think.
Well, initially, and then he decided that his stuff was of such high quality that he was going to ship in equal quantity to X-Men on a returnable basis. And he called this Neil's folly because he said this was either really going to make his company or it was going to break his company. But the problem came in is that some of the retailers who got these extra free copies didn't want them. So they wouldn't even pick them up. Some of the distributors didn't want to distribute them to accounts that didn't order them, even though they were, free copies that they'd be billed for later, trying to use the newsstand model for comic retailers. And so he spent a lot of money on printing, which drove down on his per unit cost, I'm sure, tremendously. But it spent a lot of money on printing, and that kind of ended continuity comics.
So what do they have coming out new continuity comics? What is the new product? Do you know offhand? What's new? Lost you.
I'm sorry, we're freezing here.
I think we're back.
Okay, yeah, we're good.
All right. No,
Just a little edit there and we're all fine.
we got everything up until my last question, which was, what new comic is coming out from Continuity Comic Books in previews? What
Doing
is
a hardcover. They're doing a hardcover. It was in previews, and it's going to reprint some of the black and white and pencil and ink, and it's just a chance to get a chance to see the stuff and see the quality of the stuff before it was colored. Sometimes that's really if you see older art, the rendering is tremendous. The rendering is less tremendous, and they expect the colorist to do more of the rendering. And so comics have changed a lot. In the old days, you hand colored with Doc Martin inks, and you just the pages, and then you gave a code, and they do color separations. They print in 4 colors with little dots that you weren't so tiny you could actually see. You see them with the naked eye a little bit in some of the cases. And now there's a variety of shading with computer coloring, but so now you see the colorist take on a lot of that aspect. But in the old days, you had to do a lot of rendering, the inker did, and so you can really see the quality of the work in the. And IDW does a huge variety of these archive editions where they do them at the size of the comic pages, and you can see the real detail in the art.
I've seen their archives and some of the stuff that they've done. They do a really good job of that type of stuff. We were talking about DC buying quality and Charlton Comics, and they now own the original Captain Marvel. But what people also don't realize is that they also own, well, Discovery now also owns Looney Tunes and the Hanna-Barbera stable of characters. Why hasn't DC, Warner, whatever, done a better job of leveraging and using those characters? I mean, you get one Looney Tunes comic book a month that comes out. I mean, why doesn't DC?
I think that Looney Tunes has 2 now, because they've been doing the Batman crossover with
yes,
with Scooby-Doo. I guess that's the Hanna-Barbera one.
Yes.
So they're doing the Looney Tunes and they're doing the Hanna-Barbera, but they've tried a variety of different things. They did a whole crossover of DC Looney Tunes.
That was really good.
They did a crossover with Hanna-Barbera. They tried bringing Hanna-Barbera, instead of being like Saturday morning animated, being more traditional comic style.
Yeah, you had Scooby-Doo. You had the Scooby-Doo Apocalypse a few years ago. You had a redoing of the Flintstones a while back. But it's like, outside of that, it's like you have these great decade-long property that nobody's doing anything with at all.
I think that the problem becomes that printing has gotten to the point where the print runs are small and the cost is expensive.
Who owns all
the? You don't have enough
to get it all together.
Well, I'm sorry, what?
They don't have enough to put something together on a regular basis because the print runs would be just too small, is what you're saying.
I think that the market for that is too small. I mean, Marvel at one point published a Barbie comic.
I remember
Barbie's like the biggest movie in the country. But when I was a retailer, I used to order the Barbie comic, and anytime a customer came in with their daughter who's saying, "Dad, can we go? Dad, can we go?" I handed them a free comic. And it changed the whole dynamic, because it's, "Dad, can we go to the comic store? Dad, comic store." And there were 2 Barbie comics. And I gave them, I bought both of them as freebies. I mean, because if Dad's shopping longer, he'll buy a whole lot more comics.
Briefly, I want to talk about First Comics. It's not exactly a shared universe, but for me, and you can give pipe in, First Comics actually laid the foundation for a lot of stuff later on in the comic book country. First Comics laid the foundation for a lot of stuff that came in the comic book industry later, like stuff that came through with Image, because they got a lot of, back then, First Comics had a lot of name brand creators involved. Howard Chaykin, Grell, Joe Staten. That seems to be like a template of First Comics was like a template for some of the stuff that came like in Image later on and some of the other publishers. What exactly happened with Image that it just never survived? Because it was doing good for so long and it just went belly up like in the late 80s.
I think that initially, well, First Comics was a little different than Image.
Yeah.
in that First Comics actually, I believe, owned most of the stuff they published.
Oh,
There
they
was a
did.
creator component in it, but in Image, the creators own 100%.
So I didn't know
So
first.
Image is more of a guild publishing where you're paying for their marketing and you're paying for their printing press and their distribution and all that, but really your own business and you have to invest in you. And some people don't have the financial wherewithal to do that. And with First Comics, I think that that wasn't so much the case. I think you got a percentage and they got a percentage, but it was newer in the business industry. It was a time when people couldn't really afford to do that themselves. Um, but First Comics had Mike Gold there, who ended up being the Batman editor. And he contacted a lot of different creators and had them do creator-owned properties. And most of them weren't superheroes, although some of them were superheroes. Nexus is a superhero who's also an assassin, who's also, a sci-fi character. So it's a little different. Badger is also another superhero that I really enjoyed from there, where he's kind of crazy and got some magical elements in there too with him. But some of them were more straightforward. John Sable never wore a costume.
John Sable is my
A but and it was popular, but everything has its course. I mean, most comics are reaching issue 100, and so it's really bringing in the next wave of creators. Because the problem is because you'd think like something like Superman that runs for 1,000 issues, something like Flash or Wonder Woman that are just hitting 1,000 issues, or 800 issues. Spider-Man at like 700 issues, like that. They detract an audience forever. But a lot of comics, even from Marvel and DC, have tremendous trouble hitting that number 100. And so, as the audience wanes, you have to bring in new readers to make for your lost readers as people come and go. And I think that's the problem that all these companies have. And I think towards the end, First Comics was losing more readers than they were gaining. I think that when the original creators left some of these series, when John Sable freelance just became Sable without without Grell, I think that people didn't stick around as much, even though they had a TV series coming out. And the
yeah.
TV series wasn't overly successful either, so that didn't bring in new readers.
Yeah, Grell's Sable is one of my favorite comic books in the independents when it first came out. It's just such a
Absolutely.
I would love to see that stuff reprinted
But
entirely again.
a Comic Mix is reprinting those.
Oh, they are finally getting
putting them in trades.
Awesome. When's the next Lost Universe come out? Is there another one
So
planned?
Lost Universe has had 2 issues so far, and just what we're talking about is basically what goes into Lost Universe. They're all the characters that started again, and some of them never came back again. And so, J.C. Vaughn, they're a group. He has some Golden Age stories, some more modern stories if they're published. I'm working on Quality Comics as the Golden Age component for the next issue, which was kind of appropriate. We talked about the quality heroes. But it's fun. You can't collect comics for any length of time without having your favorite comic be canceled.
At least once or twice.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's basically what Lost Universe is. You're reading this comic every month and then it stops.
The Lost Universe.
Sometimes the publisher just goes out of business.
The Lost Universe, Overstreet Comic Book Price Guide, The Lost Universe is available everywhere. It's in a paperback edition, now available in a digital edition. Highly recommend it. Looks like a lot of fun. I was looking at the first edition of the one. It was 608 pages for $21. That is a huge, great deal. That is for any comic book historian. Should just check something like that out. Rik Offenberger from G-Man, First Comics, Lost Universes. Closing thoughts, anything you want to say before we wind this up today?
I absolutely love comics. I have my whole life since I was a small child. And I think that for any fan out there, just, go through a back issue bin, pick out something. Some of them are finite, but if I'm a company business, it's not a whole lot different than picking up a mini series. You'll actually know as a mini series, and you know what you're in for. I mean, yes, back issues have become sort of like the streaming for comics. Yeah, give a second life to them, and your retailer will appreciate that you buy the back issues, and it's fun.
Rik Offenberger, thanks for joining me today. We'll have you back on the podcast. As always, very enlightful conversation. Thanks for joining me today.